Hello everyone, my name is Max Eriksson. I'm going to talk to you about aquatic invasive species in the Great Lakes, recreational anglers, and the importance of the border between the US and Canada. And this talk is going to be focused on data that was collected during 2018 and 19 at the University of Illinois. You can see my collaborators under the title, and at the top you have our funders, which was mainly the USDA and the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission. Fundamentally, this is human dimensions, so we're interested in preferences of anglers towards AIS and the general future of the Great Lakes. And we're interested in national differences. So why do we care about this then? Well, aquatic invasive species have a lot of negative impacts. We know that it's economically harmful and it's really harmful to ecosystems and biology. And human activity really contributes to the spread of AIS. And it makes perfect sense to assume that national borders matter, which means that in the Great Lakes region, people are going to spread AIS differently on both sides of the border. Maybe, we don't know. That's the key here. So, why would borders matter? Well, there are differences between US and Canada. The ecological and biological differences are maybe not likely to be large, given that it's so geographically close and the systems are connected. But there's differences in terms of institutional structure and culture that might be really important for what people actually do out there on the water. Culture and demographics is easy to understand. It's practices developed over a long time that kind of decides what you as an individual can do. The same goes for institutions, which used in the broad sense here includes everything from direct rules regarding fisheries management, fishing licenses, fishing dates, and everything, up to things like how many days off you get at a government job, or much larger things dealing with the structure of society. All these things affect individuals, and it affects traditional human dimensions, things like attitudes, values, norms, and ultimately behavioral intentions. And that's essentially also what we measure here, stated preferences, what people say they want. So our purpose is to examine how natural differences among anglers in the Great Lakes region could impact AIS management. And how do we study this? Well, we assess stated preferences on both sides of the border. And then we discuss how these patterns could possibly impact AIS management. To accomplish this, we conducted surveys. On the American side, we conducted a mailback survey with an online option in Michigan, Wisconsin, New York, and Illinois. Each state we sampled 1,200 individuals from a pool that was living adjacent to a Great Lakes and had bought a recreational fishing license in 2018. On the Canadian side, we sampled all users of the app Angler's Atlas in Ontario, which is an app you can get weather in, you can get some maps, and you can also have your fishing license in it. And you can see on this map how the totality of our sampling strategy was. In terms of analysis, we settle on stated choice analysis because it's a way to kind of get at people's preferences without asking them directly. It comes from economics, and it assumes that people will always choose the option that makes most sense to them if you give them a choice. So if we give them a lot of choices and switch around the values of those variables in those choices, we can figure out what the different variables are worth to people. So in our case, we ask people to choose between different future scenarios related to the Great Lakes. So all respondents were given 6 choices, and in each of those choices had 3 options or 3 scenarios to choose from. And each scenario is then built up of 5 attributes. And these attributes are set at various levels, and people are then asked to choose which of the scenarios they prefer. So here's an example. So in one of those 6 choices people were given, they would have 3 scenarios. Option A, option B, and option C would be scenarios here, and respondents were asked to simply choose which one they would like. And as you can see here, all the columns are attributes. So we have 5 attributes in our model, and this model was given to everyone who answered the survey. You have wash stations, which could take the 3 levels. You could have no wash stations, voluntary wash stations, or mandatory wash stations. You have added cost per fishing trip that had 5 steps varying from $0 to $20 with $5 increments. You had a change in the amount of fish available that had 5 steps and went from -20 to +20%. Impact from invasive species had 3 levels: minimal, moderate, and severe. Fish habitat had 3 levels: poor, good, and excellent. And then for each scenario, we varied these variables and asked each respondent to answer 6 of these comparisons. And by doing this, we then could get a sense of what, or an estimate of what an individual valued mandatory wash stations, for instance. And those values would be called utilities. In terms of modeling, we then do a logistic regression on this, and we separated the Canadian and the US data, given that the sampling wasn't identical in the both places. But in terms of interpretation, you end up with a regression model, and the regression coefficients can be interpreted as utility. And the larger positive utility you have, the stronger the positive preference you have, and the opposite is true for negative effects. So you can interpret it pretty much as a standard. In terms of collected data, we ended up with a response rate of 27% in the US and 12% in the Canadian web sample. And on the Canadian side, we also had to exclude a lot of people with inaccurate email addresses and old email addresses that didn't even open our email. In general, the Canadians were a bit younger, a bit more diverse, but both places had a overrepresentative of male respondents. And well, we know that male sampling reaches older respondents, and we know that white males are overrepresented in the literature. So we're working on comparing these things with the census to figure out whether or not these differences are due to overall demographic differences between the countries or something related to our sample. Moving on to estimation, looking at our logistic model, I just want to say that all of these attributes were statistically significant. So I didn't bother with the stars here. Everything is significant in statistical terms. The question then, of course, becomes what is actually significant? And in terms of those kind of notable effects, I would say that one interesting finding is that wash stations, people seem to care about wash stations. Voluntary and mandatory wash stations, people are positive to that both in the US and the Canadian sample, as opposed to having no wash stations. Another thing to note is that both US and Canadians are very negative towards severe impacts of AIS. Overall, you can also see that this model fit the Canadian sample better with an R-square of 24 or 0.24 and a US R-square of 0.14. Looking at differences between the countries, this graph shows you the same estimates we just looked at, but the US sample is in purple and the Canadian sample is in yellow. And the means are the circles, and surrounding the means you have confidence intervals denoting a 25% confidence interval. And looking at this, we can see, firstly, Canadian anglers seem to assign higher utility to habitat quality. So Canadians respondents were more concerned about fish habitat quality than American respondents. Both have a significant positive effect, but Canadians cared more. Secondly, Canadians assigned a higher utility to moderate impact from AIS. And they also assigned a positive utility to a moderate impact of AIS, which is really interesting. Other than that, you can see the two samples have pretty similar preferences. So what does this mean in terms of management then? Well, respondents were positive to wash stations. This means that there's not likely to be any resistance to even mandatory wash stations, not to mention voluntary, which everyone probably is likely to enjoy. Another thing we found was that respondents were not that sensitive to increased costs either. If you remember, that cost effect size wasn't that big. So anglers have a small negative preference against cost. They don't like cost, but the effect is really, really small, suggesting that as long as the costs are improving something else and anglers see it as worth it, they're likely to support small fees to combat AIS. And then, of course, the main finding is that respondents care about AIS. They were negative towards severe AIS impacts on both sides of the border. So messaging focused on AIS is likely to get people's attention. And theoretically, back to our point, there were differences in preferences between the two samples. Well, Canadian respondents were more concerned about habitat quality than US respondents, and most interestingly, Canadian respondents were more positive towards having moderate impacts from AIS. In fact, Canadians were positive while Americans were negative, which could be a case of environmental factors. They might want to fish something that's only available up there, or there might be cultural or institutional differences. But the main takeaway we have here is that we need more human dimensions work on both sides of the border. We need to understand how this border impacts, especially if we're going to do work in the Great Lakes. So, thank you for watching, and please contact me if you have any questions or anything like that. Thank you.